Adam Leon Smith is a CTO in technology consultancy called Dragonfly. They do quality and testing and lots of good consultancy work. He's also, by the way, the chair of the BCS Specialist Interest Group on software testing. So Adam is a real expert in how you ensure that the product and outcomes from your work are of good quality.
Thank you very much, Simon. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about managing quality in consulting. As Simon said, I'm Chief Technology Officer for a consultancy. So I've been a consultant for probably 20 years, the majority of my career in various forms. I've worked as a consultant. And a consultant to me means somebody that is advising a client on how to solve a problem. As Simon said, I also do a lot of work in software testing, and I'll give you some examples as we go through of interesting quality problems that I've faced in my career. I'm also a fellow of the BCS, and you can reach me on Twitter at Adam Leon Smith for direct messages, questions, or anything after the talk. So let's get straight into it. So what is quality? So I'm going to reference back to the extremely dull ISO 9001, which is the supremo of quality management standards. And you'll see contracts all over the place that talk about ISO 9001 as a quality standard. And it's a good starting point, but it is somewhat dated and it is somewhat formal for how people tend to work these days. But before I get into the definition, you'll see, if you look towards the end of the definition, it talks about products, processes, and services. So I just wanted to ask a question, and I'm just going to use the low-tech chat here. Is consulting delivering products, processes, or services? What do you all think? Teabags. Okay, so people think services. Okay. Yeah. Outcomes. I like that. So I would agree with outcomes. I think consulting might be delivering a product. Lots of consultancies are brought in specifically for their skills in building a product. Some consultancies are brought in equally with their skills around process management, business process outsourcing, for example, process improvement. Even within quality management, there's quality process improvement and test process improvement. And services as well. Consultancies can help to improve services. So we might be delivering outcomes relating to products, outcomes relating to processes, or outcomes relating to services. But we tend to deliver a thing, which I'm going to refer to as a deliverable. A deliverable to me is something that you can put in a wheelbarrow and deliver to a client and say, I'm done. Here's what you asked for. So again, that could be any of these things, or it could be a fantastic presentation, as Gary was outlining, talking you through some of these different things. Within the space I work mostly in, which is systems, software and systems, and particularly artificial intelligence, we break down all the different possible properties and characteristics of products and services in a very, very formal way, and do all sorts of specific structured activities to verify and validate those properties and characteristics. But you might be delivering a presentation. You might be delivering a change in an organization. There's all sorts of things that you can be asked to do as a consultant. But one of the things that I think consultancy is it's typically a short-term, knowledge-based activity. And it's very different managing quality in that kind of activity to managing quality in a repeatable task that's done many, many times. A lot of the origins of quality management come from Japan. There's lots of famous people in Japan who worked with all sorts of great techniques to improve manufacturing quality. And that was in fact a significant driver in leading to the boom in manufacturing in Japan. You'll hear about a lot of techniques such as Kaizen and things like that have Japanese sounding phrases because of that. So quality is the degree to which the properties and characteristics of what we're doing satisfies the requirements which ensue from the purpose. So there's few different kinds of quality baked into that. I can ask you to paint my bedroom, and I can ask you to make sure there's no like drips anywhere, and I can ask you to make sure you do it with a matte paint, for example. But I might not specify the exact color. I might assume that you would paint it a sensible color, and I might come home to a neon green bedroom. That's not necessarily fulfilling the requirements that ensue from the purpose. I might want a nice color in my bedroom, but it's ensuing from the requirements that I gave you because I didn't say what color I wanted it. So why is quality important? So for a product, it's often to stand out. So you might, if you're of a certain age, remember that Google wasn't the first search engine. We had Lycos, Ask Jeeves, Alta Vista, Yahoo, and probably others I've forgotten about. And there was a period of about 8 or 9 years where there wasn't a Google. And how did Google become the market leader? By having the best search. So they optimized the quality of their product, and they leapfrogged a handful of other competitors within quite a short period of time. And you can see that example all across industry and hardware and consumer products in particular, where quality means that companies can leapfrog each other competitively. For a service, it's to obtain and retain customers. By providing better service, you increase your brand perception, you obtain and retain customers. So consultants may be brought in to advise on the quality of a product. They might be brought in to advise on how to improve the quality of a service. But intrinsic to all of that is the quality of the consulting. And I kind of have this duality in that I'm delivering consultancy on quality, but also worrying about the quality of the consultancy, which, you know, it becomes second nature, but it's a little bit confusing. So for a consultant, it's really important that you're delivering quality. I mean, certainly to me, if I feel like I haven't delivered quality, I feel really bad about taking the money from the client. Even if it's not going to me, it's going to my employer. I feel an intrinsic need to deliver a value in the region of what the customer is paying. But it's also important to retain clients. As a consultant, you know, even if you change employers over years, you know, clients may still come back to you if you deliver really high quality work again and again. But isn't delivering quality expensive? Well, actually it's not. The chap called Phil Crosby, who said quality is free. It's not a gift, but it's free. The unquality things are what cost money. And I think this qualifies as a contrast in a quote. It's not quite Michelle Obama, but I think it qualifies. The things that lose you money are often quality, and it's the opposite of what I put on the previous slide. It's the companies that don't respond to your calls, that give you bad service, whose websites don't work. You know, people never used to change banks, but I think I've changed bank about 5 times in the past 5 years. Now we have more digital banking. And that's because I can't get the service I need from incumbent banks. They want things from me that I don't want to do, like, you know, go into branches or write to them or use a checkbook. You know, and I've moved to banks that allow me to use an app to do all the things I need. I never have to talk to anyone unless I really, really want to. But that leads on to another problem. Quality is different depending on who you are. Different stakeholders, different customers, different people who are paying you as a consultant might have different needs and wants about what they want to get from your consultancy. So quality is not the same thing to everyone. It is in the eye of the beholder. So what's poor quality from a consulting point of view? So first of all, deliverables that aren't what was asked for. On the right-hand side, you may have seen this diagram before. I've seen about 10 variations of it that can explain how someone can ask for something, and then the various stages of communication, the various project forms that people have to fill out, requirement specifications, design specifications, etc., start to lose detail and start to move away from the quality that was originally desired by the person that asked for it. And there's various ways to try and mitigate this depending on how you're working. You might be working in a very old, sorry, I'm not going to say old-fashioned. You might be working in a very sequential approach to delivering a project or a deliverable. You might be having phases and things are being passed between phases, and you're doing quality checks at each point to check back on what was originally asked for. Or you might be working in a very accelerated, more agile style environment where you're constantly involving everybody into the process, constantly asking for customer feedback. Now, both have slightly different quality approaches, quality management approaches. Both are also completely valid approaches. You know, people talk about agile a lot, but it's very hard to do agile when you're building, say, a spaceship, as has been in the news a lot this week. So one of the big problems is deliverables that aren't what was originally asked for. Another big quality problem in consultancy deliverables is they don't meet expectations, not necessarily specified expectations, not necessarily things people asked for, but things they needed. And maybe they didn't tell you they needed them. Maybe that's because they didn't know. Maybe that's because they thought you knew. Sometimes we have to, as consultants, we have to say, are you sure that's what you really need? And part of the job is bringing our expertise to the customer and challenging what they asked for to help improve it. So quality really starts right at that stage of when people ask for something, of trying to make sure that that's what they really want. Another problem is not meeting implicit standards. People expect all sorts of different things. I've had customers who are upset because my deliverable was printed on A4 instead of letter, or delivered in a PDF. It was A4 instead of letter, because they're an American client. I've worked with people who've reviewed my work and changed all sorts of things in my grammar and things like that for reasons that aren't necessarily explicitly specified, but are more stylistic. The worst thing you can do, though, as a consultant, is deliver things that are not factual or don't represent the best advice that you could possibly give. So here's a bunch of risks that we have. And I know Simon's going to talk about some other risks as well. These risks can be mitigated in a number of different ways. And some of the techniques that you might use will depend on the type of activity that you're trying to manage the quality of. So remember I said at the start, you could be working on something relating to a product, a process, or a service. Now, in terms of your deliverable, that's very much a one-off activity usually, but you might be looking at the quality of an ongoing service or process. So just on the left, a bit of an idea of the things that might be relevant for quality management on a repeated activity. Metrics and SLAs are very, very important, because if something is being done many times a week, many times a day, many times an hour, there will always be people who are unhappy with quality. So you have to take a statistical approach of looking at how often things are being achieved on average. And that's really important when you're dealing with a service or a process. You can also use checklists. So I remember, I'll go back to one of my first ever jobs, which was doing tax calculations for a pension provider. And this was actually on paper at the time in the late 90s. And for every calculation I had to write up my workings, then I had a big checklist where I had to tick off all the things and make sure I'd done them. And then when I'd done them, I had to send them off for peer review. And I wasn't allowed to do them on my own until I'd had 20 peer reviewed and confirmed were correct. At that point, I still had to use the checklist, but I was allowed to send them out without peer review. What does peer review mean? It means one of your peers, maybe someone of the same level, maybe someone slightly more experienced than you, who's reviewing your work. Review is such an important process when it comes to quality. It's not a repeated activity, but when I'm writing code, one of the most useful learning experiences I've ever had is going through peer review with someone that has had a different experience or a different learning background to me. The feedback I've got from peer review on code and documents has been probably one of the biggest learning experiences of my life, as well as significantly improving the quality of my output. After thing you can do with repeated activities is surveys. You might have heard of NPS, Net Promoter Score. It's when you get asked, after you've used a service, you get asked how likely would you be to recommend this to a friend or a colleague or something like that. Those kind of surveys can be really useful in getting feedback from customers, because you can't usually manage the quality without getting some feedback from your customers or your stakeholders. And if that is a large scale repeated activity, customer surveys can be a really, really valuable tool. Another really valuable tool is automated checks, particularly if you're doing something very data orientated, something relating to something that affects data quality, something that is very automated. Automated checks increasingly provide a very, very valuable way to get information on the quality of a process or a service. But let's look at one-off activities. So knowledge bases are one of the most valuable tools. Knowledge bases can help standardize, so they can help your consultancy team standardize on their terminology, their definitions. This seems basic, but in every domain, there are different pieces, different terminology, different terms that are used by different people in slightly different ways. You can at least get your internal specialist team to focus on agreeing the key terminology and then the key processes and the key pieces of domain knowledge that might be relevant. It's a great way to share knowledge inside a consultancy team. Another example is acceptance criteria. So I worked on a really big project with hundreds and hundreds of people working on all the IT infrastructure for Her Majesty's prisons. And we had a huge amount of deliverables coming from a huge amount of different suppliers. And there were consultants everywhere. And there were thousands of tasks in a project plan. And we just didn't have any confidence that that project plan was going to come together because it was so big. It had all these thousands of tasks in. We knew 1,000 tasks, hundreds of people. How can it be possible that there aren't mistakes in how this all hangs together? So my job was to go through every task on the project plan, sit down with the person doing it, and to ask them what they thought was the definition of done, which is another word for acceptance criteria. What did they think they needed to do to make sure that that activity or deliverable was going to be ready to hand off to the next person in the chain? And I did that for thousands of activities, and we found hundreds of issues in the project plan, hundreds of mismatches of expectations about what people were going to do in their deliverable and what the expected outputs and quality of those outputs was. Another example, you might be doing one-off activities, but you can still have templates, okay? You might have a presentation template from Gary. You might have a template for just something simple like a statement of work with a client, or an end of project report, or even a lessons learned template. Just having templates that are generic, that you can apply to lots of sort of activities that you do in consulting that aren't specific to the task, that can be really useful. Domain expert review is a really valuable activity, especially in a complex domain. So I'm working on a report at the moment for the International Standards Organization about bias in AI systems. And I've been working on that for 2.5 years. It's 44 pages, so it's not very long. We've been working on it for 2.5 years. And I think we've had over 1,000 hours of meetings to review comments on the drafts. And that's because it's a complex technical topic, and it's because people take the quality of international standards very seriously. So that's been probably my most rigorous experience of quality management on a document. Walkthroughs is another key topic, key activity and technique that you can do with domain experts or even just peers. The biggest example I've got of this is where my firm was involved in replacing 1/3 of the UK payment infrastructure overnight, and there was no way to go back. And if we got it wrong, then people were going to be unable to pay at card terminals all over the UK. And we had all sorts of problems because we were trying to replicate complex payment logic that had been written in the 1960s that wasn't really understood. And we got people out of retirement. We got business experts from other companies, from other credit card companies and providers like Visa and MasterCard. And we walked through about 20 transactions a day for about 3 or 4 months. So we had 20 people in a room for 3 or 4 months, just reviewing credit card transactions for quality, because that was such a high risk activity and we really couldn't afford to get it wrong. But the best thing you can do, especially during a consultancy engagement, is asking for feedback. Constantly ask your customer for feedback. Check in with them throughout your engagement. Are you doing the right thing? Are you heading towards the right outcome? Are you producing the individual assets that they're expecting? So quality management is a huge topic, and this is quality management in kind of boiled down to a single slide, which is very reductionist. So I want to come up with the top 6 tips that I've got for introducing a quality focus in your consulting team. So the first one is plan. As soon as you've defined a deliverable that exists, establish acceptance criteria or the definition of done if you're in an agile environment, and establish who's going to be involved in reviewing that. That might be your customer, it might be your stakeholders, it might be your colleague, it might be your manager, it might be Bob over there who's an expert in this particular topic. Maybe he doesn't even work for your consultancy, maybe he works for the client. Establish a place where knowledge can be shared amongst the team. I love wikis, and I love slightly chaotic knowledge management portals that don't have change control and everyone can contribute to. You might be different, your team might be different, that's okay too. But find somewhere that knowledge can be shared and that everyone can benefit, and take the time to document what you know for your colleagues. Establish some basics, templates with approval lists, version control, simple stuff like page numbers that should be obvious but just aren't there by default when you hit up a new Google Doc or a new Word document. Be really clear. I touched on reviews, but be really clear about who reviews what kind of deliverables. And remember that the more reviews you have, the higher the quality output you will produce. When a client gives you information, make a lot of notes. I know there's been a presentation earlier in this course about interviewing clients, but it's really important because you might take away 20% of the information that you're told. You might need 80% of that information in order to convince your client or in order to make a reasoned case for it in your deliverable. I take a lot of notes, I record things where the client doesn't mind, and I refer back to that constantly to do quality checks on my own work, to make sure that I haven't, through my own bias or through listening to the client person I've spoken to last, rather than and having forgotten the person I spoke to first. And number 6, ask your client for feedback as regularly as you can. It is what they think that matters, not what anyone else thinks. And that's it.
Yeah, there was just a little bit of conversation there about whether there's support that we have or could offer about peer review. I think in the context, it's more a question of peer review with the people you are actually working on the same kind of content with. As you'll hear in just a moment, in a big firm, you'll almost certainly have your outputs reviewed by somebody senior to you in the firm. But I think we're already slightly past 8 o'clock, so we probably should push straight on, I'm afraid.